like that. So we're going to think about some different brain changes that are happening and what we can do to help people. Before we do that, I want you to think to yourself what food makes you feel like this. This is me at approximately age 2 or 3. I've been enjoying food since the 1980s, and Hershey's doesn't pay me to put their syrup on my presentation. I wish they would. But chocolate is the food that makes me feel like this. So turn to your neighbor really quick and just tell them, what is the food in your life that makes you feel like that? All right, what are some of our foods? Popcorn?
French fries.
French fries.
Apple pie and ice cream.
Apple pie and ice cream, which Steve had today.
Yeah.
Nice. So, Bacon. Oh, excellent. Yeah. Now, cheese. Okay, so I notice a lot of fatty foods and a lot of salty foods and a lot of sugary foods. Interesting. We'll keep that for later. But food has a really big significance in our lives, not only to keep us alive, but culturally and socially. And so when people are living with dementia, we really want to support them in having a pleasant dining experience and also continuing to participate in that meaningful occupation of eating and dining with others. So take another moment, talk to your neighbors. What skills does it take to eat? So for example, one of the skills would be you have to be able to get your hand from the food to your mouth, right? You have to get the food and bring it to your mouth. So that's an example. Talk to your neighbors for just a second. What skills does it take to eat?
Swallowing.
All right, what do we got? What do we got? How about this table up here? I heard some good stuff. Chewing, right. You got to be able to chew the food. What about this table? Cutting. You got to cut the food sometimes. Yeah, what about this table? Scoop. You got to be able to get your wrist to do this action, right? We call it supination in the therapy world. Oh, yeah, impress your friends next time you're at a party. What about this table? Vision. You have to be able to see that there's food in front of you and recognize that it's food, right? Your brain has to tell you that is food. I see it there. Yeah. What's that table? Smell. Yeah, if we can't smell the food, we're probably not going to enjoy it very much and we just might not eat it, right? Nice. What about this table?
Hi.
You have to taste it. Oh, taste and appetite. Yeah, those are two different skills. Good. What about this table? Anything different? They're all okay. Anything else? Texture. Dealing with hot food. Always have to protect yourself by making sure that you don't burn yourself with your food. Yeah. Wow. You'll swallow. Yeah. Okay, so our list is getting pretty long, right? So this is a list that I came up with. You all came up with a lot of these as well, right? Appetite, recognizing food, attention span. So how long does it take to eat something? I have to sit there and focus on the task long enough. Vision, sitting balance. I have to be able to hold myself upright. If I'm falling over, I'm not going to be able to eat as effectively. If I can't hold myself up and I'm falling forward, I have to be able to hold my body up. Energy, endurance, using my arm, using the tools. You all talked about being able to move our wrists, move our arms, chewing, swallowing, all of these skills. And unfortunately, a lot of these skills can be affected when people are living with dementia. So we heard earlier from our speakers about how dementia affects different parts of the brain depending on which type of dementia you have. So I'm going to talk pretty broadly about dementia, right? So knowing that some of these you might see and some you might not see depending on what disease you're facing. But just be on the lookout because we're all detectives looking for what's changing. So I'm going to show you some brain pictures throughout this time together. Has anybody seen these pictures before? Some people nodding heads. This came from the University of Alabama quite some time ago, and it shows a brain on the left that a person died of an accident. Both of these people agreed to donate their brains before they died. And the person on the other side got dementia, decided to donate their brain when they were able to make that choice. And so you notice that the brain on the left is much bigger, it's much juicier, it's much healthier than the brain on the right. And these two brains were the same in every way before they died, demographically the same. And so we're going to see some pictures that'll help us to see what's actually going on in the brain, and then we'll think about the skills that are being affected there. So here's all the things we're going to talk about. Oh, I forgot to set my timer. Ellen's going to give me the high sign when I got like 5 minutes left, and then we'll start talking real fast. So these are the brain changes we're going to talk about. You probably will recognize some of these from the people living with dementia in your life and some of the changes that are happening. We're going to relate them to our dining experience and what might happen. So the first part of the brain we're going to talk about is the amygdala, which is another one of my favorite party words. It's one of my favorite parts of the brain, and it's really in the core part of our brain. It keeps us alive. So way back, our ancestors, when they were facing the saber-toothed tiger, the amygdala is what steps in to help them, right? It says, whoa, there's a tiger there, I gotta be careful, whoa, right? So it perceives threats. The other thing the amygdala does that's great for us is that it seeks pleasure. And so that's what's seeking sugar, fat, salt, all the things that we like so that we can store all that stuff up in our bodies for the winter, right, when things are difficult, way back in our ancestry, right? And so it's what's keeping us alive. It's that thrive to survive, right? And so the amygdala actually remains for almost all types of dementia through the very end of the disease. So people will still have this drive to have pleasure, but they will also have the ability to perceive a threat. So what if my friend over here is living with dementia and he is on his way to get his 5th cookie in the last 20 minutes, right? And I say, no, Cecil, you've had enough cookies, right? Cecil's amygdala is saying, I need a cookie, and if I don't get that cookie, what's going to happen to me, right? Now, it might be a like, it might be a want, it might be a need. What am I to Cecil's primitive brain? Right. A saber-toothed tiger telling him, you can't have that. And so what is Cecil going to do?
Bingo.
He might hit me, he might try to get me out of the way, he might start yelling ugly things at me. That's going to trigger his amygdala because all of a sudden, I'm coming between Cecil and what he needs. So we always want to keep that in the back of our mind. How can I be not a saber-toothed tiger to someone living with dementia, right? How can I help them get their needs met and not be a threat? All right, so we're going to dig into some of these brain changes. I start with memory because everybody knows that short-term memory is a challenge, long-term memory remains. And so I want to kind of give an example of that as we start. This woman, her name is Elizabeth, and I started my career working in assisted living. And I didn't know that I liked working with people with dementia, but I really needed a job because I was 22. And so I said, sure, I'll work on the dementia care floor. Sounds great. I got there and I fell in love with the people there. And Elizabeth is one of those people that I fell in love with. And her daughter gave me her permission to use her picture and to tell stories about her in order to honor her memory and to thank her for all the things that she taught me. And so Elizabeth, she was about 95 when I met her. She would walk around the unit. She was always impeccably dressed, as you can tell. She enjoyed tea time with us. She was a Holocaust survivor. She was from Munich. She was born in Munich in the mid-19-teens. And she always had a fabulous German accent. She'd say, oh, hello, dear. And, you know, when are you coming back? She was always very concerned when I was leaving. When are you coming back? And so Elizabeth and I had a special connection. And one of my jobs at the assisted living was to serve breakfast, because all of the other staff was helping to get people up and ready for the day. So I was in the dining room and I knew what everybody liked for breakfast, and I would get their breakfast ready. So Elizabeth comes in, she has her breakfast, and I've been working there for 6 months or so at this point. I think I know everybody pretty well, and I think I've learned a few things because I'm 22 and I was real smart. And so I thought, okay, I got Elizabeth's breakfast. And Elizabeth eats her breakfast, and then she goes into the day room where people would spend the day, the living room. And so I clear her plate, waiting for everybody else to come. Other people are coming in, coming out. About 10 minutes later, here comes Elizabeth. She comes in, she sits down the same place she sits every time. And I'm helping other people get their food, and she says, "Where's my food?" Oh, I'm 22 and real smart. So I said, "Well, Elizabeth, you already had breakfast." Oh, how did this go, right? Sonia already told us this is not a good idea, right? So she said, "No, I didn't have my breakfast." And ooh, right? And so I'm thinking, oh gosh, she's real mad at me. So I just get her another breakfast. She goes on her way, has her breakfast, goes on her way. So I'm thinking the next day, I'm like, okay, I'm 22 and I'm real smart. So Elizabeth has her breakfast, she leaves. I leave her plate there. It's dirty. And I'm thinking, okay, so when she comes back, sure enough, she comes back, she sits down, and she says, "Where's my breakfast?" And I said, "Well, Elizabeth, you already had your breakfast. See, your plate's right here." She says, "That's not my plate, that's someone else's plate." Like, oh no, I thought I had it, right? So the next day, I give her a breakfast that is a little bit smaller, right? Because I know she's gonna come back. Well, she said, "Well, how come you gave me only 2 sausages? Everybody else got 3 sausages." Right? And so in my brain, I'm trying to come up with all these different things because Elizabeth's short-term memory is telling her I didn't have any breakfast. So sometimes we have to get creative when we think about, okay, is this just annoying to me that Elizabeth's short-term memory is not working? And maybe I could just give her 2 breakfasts and see what happens. And that's what I ended up doing. And this happened for a couple days, and then it stopped. No harm, no foul. Elizabeth ate too much breakfast for a few days, right? Now, if this had continued, I might have had to get a little more creative. Well, what's Elizabeth doing when she's leaving? Does she have a meaningful activity when she leaves? Or is she getting bored and that's why she's coming back? That's why her brain is saying, "Oh, I see the sun coming up, I guess I should go," right? So some of these challenges with short-term memory aren't quite as easy to solve as we think they are. And we try something, and then we try something else, and then we try something else. But as we learn, just telling Elizabeth, "You already had your breakfast," probably not going to help her, right? So when we think about short-term memory, so we could use cues, empty plates. For some people that might work, clocks and cues. You've already had your breakfast. It's not yet breakfast time. Look at the clock. For some people that might not work. And we might have to get a little more creative. We might have to give smaller portions. We might have to just be okay with the fact that Elizabeth has more breakfast for a little while, right? Long-term memories, often preserved. So we really want to use those. We want to use those emotional memories that people are connecting to, trying to find foods that are culturally relevant for people and foods that they really will enjoy. And the final point I think here is that it's about the feeling and not the fact, right? I tried so hard to tell Elizabeth that she'd already had breakfast, but her feeling was, I'm being left out. No one is serving me. No one has given me the breakfast that I deserve. Why is no one helping me, right? And so connecting to that feeling that she's having, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth. I should have given you your breakfast. Even though I already did, that fact doesn't really matter, right? So this is another one of my favorite parts of the brain. I have a lot of favorite parts of the brain. This is another one of my favorite parts of the brain. So put your hand right up here, behind your forehead, is the frontal lobe. Has anyone in here ever been a teenager or raised teenagers? Yes? Okay. So this part of the brain doesn't develop until later. It develops in the early 20s, mid-20s for women, mid-20s to late 20s and beyond for men, right? Sometimes never. When I describe what this does for you, you will think of people in your life who do not have a fully functioning frontal lobe. You don't have to name them. So what I want us to do is think about what are some of these changes and how can we support people living with dementia. So one of the things that the frontal lobe does for us is sequencing. So it helps us to go from one part of the task to the next part of the task to the next part of the task, right? From one thing to the other. Now, what typically happens when we serve a meal? we put everything out on the table at one time, right? We get our drink and our meal, sometimes our salad, our dessert. For somebody living with dementia, that's a lot going on in one place, right? And so thinking about giving one step at a time, or if we're giving cues, instead of saying, well, Steve, you got how about you have your carrots first, and then you have a little salad, make sure you have something to drink. And it's too many cues if that sequencing function is not working well, right? So I want to give just one step cues and wait. Here, Steve, how about some carrots? I wait for Steve to eat the carrots, then we move on, right? So making choices, that's something else the front part of our brain does that might become challenging with somebody living with dementia. Has anyone ever been to a restaurant with a person living with dementia? I've seen some nods. What happens when you go to a restaurant and you have the buffet of 1,000 choices or the menu of 1,000 choices, right? It's too many choices, right? So I want to try to limit that. Maybe give the person 1 or 2 choices, maybe 2 or 3, depending on where they are. Things that I already know that they like, perhaps, so that they can't really make a wrong choice. If that's even too hard, maybe just giving, so Steve, we've got hamburgers tonight. Is that good? You know? And Steve might say no, and then I could give another choice. I have to make sure I'm okay with the answer no if I'm going to ask him a yes or no question. Right? Well, sorry, I know you don't want that, but that's all we got. So we got to be careful with our questions because we don't want to give a false choice to someone. And so the other thing we might do is say, Steve, here you go. Here's the hamburger for tonight. Right? So now Steve can see the hamburger, and now his brain is visually noticing, ooh, that's food. Oh, that smells good. Oh, and then he wants to eat that, right? So if I say a hamburger or turkey, Steve's brain may or may not be able to figure out what those things are. So I always want to show if I can. So another thing the executive function does for us is impulse control. This is where you really see this with your teenagers, right? If you don't have impulse control, the car can go 120, so that's what we're going to go, right? So this happens when people are living with dementia. Again, we've got the whole plate, we've got the dessert, we've got the drink, and so what are we going to go for first? Probably the dessert, right? Because you and I are exercising our impulse control when we choose not to have dessert first. Now, sometimes that's a little lacking at the end of the day, right? So sometimes you and I don't make that choice. And so maybe if we're okay with that, that's a choice that we give somebody living with dementia. They want to eat their dessert first, they don't want to eat their green beans, that's fine. But making sure that that's okay, rather than presenting that to someone and then saying, no, eat your green beans first. Well, you put it in front of me, and that's what looks good, so that's what I'm going to eat, right? Because if that impulse control is changing, that's what we might see. Logical thinking, right? So this was happening as well with Elizabeth, right? Her logical thinking was changing. Even though I left her plate there, her logical thinking said, well, that's not my plate, right? Even though it actually is your plate and you've already eaten the food, right? And so I really want to validate that feeling, not the fact. Well, this is no good. I've never liked green beans. I've been living with you for 30 years and you love green beans, right? But that's the feeling that person is having today, is that something about those green beans doesn't look good to them, doesn't smell good to them, doesn't taste good to them. Something's different today, might be different again tomorrow, you never know. So I'm going to validate that. Wow, you are really not liking those green beans. I am so sorry to hear that. Let's get you something else. Right? I'm not going to argue with that. Self-awareness. So that's seeing yourself, what your skills are and what your deficits are. And so when someone's frontal lobe is changing, they're going to have difficulty with seeing themselves accurately, right? So when I say increased monitoring as a strategy we use, that just means more watching out for what they're doing, right? So noticing that they are not aware that they need to cut their food a little bit smaller now because they're having some swallowing difficulties, right? I'm just going to increase how much I'm watching them, and maybe a little bit about how much I'm helping them, because they may not be aware of some of the things that are changing for them. And then awareness of others. So being able to see someone else's perspective, right? So we all know those people in our lives who, no matter what you do, they were never going to see your point of view, right? So they're not using all of their frontal lobe. And so when that happens, we want to let it go, because my agenda might be for you to eat right now because it's really important for you to eat. But that might not be this person's agenda. So maybe I can offer something a little bit later if this is just not the time that they're looking for eating. So this next part of the brain we're going to talk about is the occipital lobe. You're learning so many fun words today that you're going to impress everyone with. So the occipital lobe is back here. It's the back part of our brain. You'll see it circle up there. Our brains are kind of flipped upside down there. And you'll see the brain on the right has quite a much bigger gap there in our occipital lobe. And so we've got quite a few changes in the way that our vision is processing when we're living with dementia. So what we know about people living with dementia is that we have a decreased visual field. It's a perception. It's not like when you have a stroke and you just lose half of it, but it's an ability to process what's coming in and make sense of it. So I'm going to put this mic down for a hot second because I want to show you something. And I want you to do this with me. So I want everybody to get your hands in front of your face and put them on like you have binoculars. Nice. Okay, good. Everybody's got their binoculars on? Okay, good. All right, keep your binoculars on. Nice. So I want you to just look around the room. Look around the room. See what you notice. Now, picture that you have a plate of food in front of you. All right, so everybody look down at your plate of food, or your folder, or your cell phone, whatever. Okay. Now, I want you to look at your neighbor. Nice. Now, where's your food? Oh, it's back. Oh, so what did you lose when you looked up at your neighbor? We lost our food, right? Yeah, so our visual field is changing. Now, when you look over at your neighbor, whose food can you see? Theirs. Uh-oh. So if they've got their pie out there, what is Steve going to do when he sees Greg's apple pie?
Oh yeah, I love apple pie.
Yeah, so then Steve is going to take Greg's apple pie. Now, how's that going to go for Greg?
I'm going to do my
boxing.
Okay, and Greg's got to eat Steve's carrot, right? And so our visual field is changing. And so we might not see the food in front of us. That's the first thing we have to know about our food is it there, right? So what I want to do, instead of being all fancy, where we, what is it, lower on the left, raise on the right? I never worked in food service, but apparently that's a good thing. But we don't want to kind of sneak the food in, right? We want to come from the front. Hey, Steve, I got your burger here, right? And I want to give it to him right in front of him where he can see it. So I might have to move around some people in order to do that if Steve is sitting at a table with other people. I also want to create enough space around Steve so that he doesn't steal Greg's food, right? So that we don't have an issue with that, especially when we're in a setting where there are lots of people with dementia dining with each other, right? So the next thing that we think about is the inability to simultaneously socialize and do the task of eating, right? And so you notice that with when you look down at your food and you looked up at your neighbor, right? And so if I'm the care partner with somebody living with dementia, I'm going to be really aware that is it every time I start talking they stop eating? So maybe I want to reduce conversation until we need to take a few minutes and digest our food, and then we'll have some conversation. It could be that the person's skill is remaining and they're able to do both things at once, but if they're noticing this visual change where they're not seeing things unless they are directly looking at them, then you might reduce your conversation. Difficulty with object recognition. So this can happen kind of in the middle part of dementia. If we think about 3 basic stages, this kind of happens in the middle where people start having difficulty recognizing what things are, right? Have you ever seen this where somebody picks up a hairbrush and starts brushing their teeth, right? Because they kind of look a little similar. It happens a lot in the bathroom setting, right? People are picking up objects that are not, and using them for the use that's not intended because they look kind of similar. So what if this is on the table? What if I've got my nice glass of milk and a nice candle because I'm making nice ambiance here on the table, right? What's going to happen if I'm living with dementia and I see those two objects, right? So I want to think about, what am I putting on the table? Do I have flowers out on the table, right? If you've ever worked in a dementia care community, you might have seen this, right? People pick up the flowers and sometimes we eat them, right? Because it looks like some kind of food, or I'm hungry, I don't recognize this is not food, right? So we have to be careful about what's in our environment, making sure everything is safe for people. So removing non-meal objects, so flowers and candles, things that are pretty, maybe taking those away when it actually is mealtime. And then providing visual cues. So just pointing to something. Here's your biscuit right here. Okay. So that people can see where their food is if they're looking around and not noticing the food. All right, reduce contrast sensitivity. So this is something that can happen when people are living with dementia. So what do we notice about this plate setting right here? Yeah, we've got a lot of white things going on. There actually is a napkin under those two plastic silverware, you can't really see. There's also a lot of little flowers that are kind of distracting on that plate, right? I've got milk in a clear glass on a white there. So how would that be different than this plate in this plate setting, right? I have colors that are popping, I have contrast. I've also placed, instead of that placemat, I've placed just a towel that I folded over. So it's okay if I get that dirty, that's forgiving. Right? I also want to think about what food I'm serving. I might have Fiesta-ware. Fiesta-ware also doesn't pay me, but it's great stuff. I also might have Fiesta-ware in different colors, right? So depending on what I'm serving to my loved one, thinking about, okay, if I'm having, broccoli and salad, I might not choose the green plate because that's all going to look the same, right? So what's going to pop based on what I'm serving? So making sure that things stand out, keep plates simple. And then decrease visual acuity and low lighting. So this can happen with dementia. A lot of these things can also happen just with people who are aging, right? We know that aging comes with a lot of other visual changes. So this might be helpful for other people in your life as well. Making sure we provide adequate lighting. And also the glare can happen. This can be an issue for people with dementia and other visual conditions. So thinking about upward lights, those lamps that have a little bowl and the light is going upward, so there's not a direct light that's causing glare. That can be helpful. And then depth perception. So this can happen a little bit later in the disease process. So if you close one eye, so everybody try that, either close one eye or block off one eye, and then put your monocular up. There you go. All right, now take your hand that you're not using, and I want you to reach out on the table and grab one of those pens or one of those blue brains that you've got on your table. Oh. So, did you, my friend Greg over here almost knocked his cup over, which I didn't even ask him to do that, but that's the point, right? Greg's brain is looking for something else. He can't get the right depth perception. And so he's running into other things. He almost knocked over his glass of water, right? So when we think about this, there's nothing I can do about that. I can't change that about this person, but what I can do is make sure that Greg's cup either has a lid on it, because he might knock it over, or I'm just okay with Greg knocking that over, right? If there's nothing special, I'm not gonna hurt the carpet, I'm not gonna hurt the table, I'm not using my finest placemats that are from my grandmother's house and they're so meaningful, right? I'm making sure that it's okay for Greg to make a mistake because he might spill that water and that's okay. So I'm changing the environment. Or I'm using objects that won't break, right? So if I'm going for something and I pick it up, I accidentally knock over the cup, is it gonna shatter all over the floor? As a caregiver, I either wanna be okay with that, or I wanna make sure that's not a big deal if that happens. And I'm forgiving to the person that I'm caring for. And then color discrimination changes. I was looking up studies on this. They're mixed as to whether that changes. So our resident physician back here might know more about that, but I saw mixed studies about whether discriminating between different colors is a thing. I know there was a study a while ago about using red, but I think there's a lot out there, so I can't say for sure. All right, our next part of the brain, temporal lobes. So if you pretend like your brain is kind of a toaster and you take a slice like this, I don't recommend it, but if you did, take this slice up like that, that's what we're seeing right here. So down here in our brain, kind of down here in about an inch or two, you will see the temporal lobes, and you have them on the left and the right. And the temporal lobes help us with processing hearing and sounds, and also producing language and sounds. So one of my mentors in the dementia care world is Tifa Snow. Some of you might know her. She is a force of nature, as I say. And she always says, language on the left and rhythm on the right. And that's how she uses to talk about the temporal lobes, right? And so on the left temporal lobe, which in our pictures it's reversed, because that's how these pictures go. But in the left temporal lobe, what we have is formal language. So this is the way I'm talking to you now in sentences that are pretty long. I'm not taking very many pauses. We just keep going. There's a lot of information. Formal language. People can have trouble with producing formal language and also receiving formal language when living with dementia. So you'll notice this if I tell Greg, so Greg, what we're going to do today is we're going to get up, we're going to make sure we have breakfast because we've got to go to this conference. It's an all-day conference, so we're going to make sure we pack a lot of snacks, and we're going to wear a jacket because sometimes conferences are, right, like, whoa, that's a lot of information, right? And so Greg is just kind of looking at me like, this is too much. I don't have it. Instead of saying, Greg, let's go get your jacket, right? So giving those step-by-step cues, right? I'm trying making hope cold by talking about jackets, right? So we're losing some of those words, both receptively and coming up with the word that we're looking for, right? Now on the right side, we preserve social chit-chat. So, hey, how you doing? What do you say when I say, hey, how you doing? Fine, how are you? Right, good Americans here we have. Yeah, fine, how are you? Now in other cultures they might say something different, right? But in America we always say, I'm fine, thank you. And in North Carolina they say, I'm fine, I hope you are, which is different. I grew up in Virginia and we don't hear that, but anyways. So, you know, that automatic social chit chat, right? Also bad words, we hear that. So you might hear, this food tastes like shit. Now I say that word intentionally, right? Because as caregivers you might hear those words and they might come out of someone's mouth that you love. And it might be hurtful. Those words are very, very offensive when people say cuss words, when they say racial slurs, when they use sexual language, degrading language. All of these things are stored on the right side of our brain. And as we can see, the right side, let's see if my pointer works. Oh yeah. The right side is holding a lot more than that left side, right? And so we're preserving that language. And so it would be really nice if Cecil would say to me, boy, you know, thank you so much for going to this effort of cooking me this really nice meal. I just really don't prefer green beans tonight. For some reason they need a little more salt, and they're just not quite the same as they usually are. Wouldn't it be so nice if my friend Cecil would talk to me that way after I've made him this nice meal, right? But instead, Cecil's going to say, what the hell is this? This is the worst damn food I've ever had, right? Because it's automatic, and it's stored on that right side, right? And so I have to be forgiving when this language is changing, when people can't find the words to communicate. And Sonia was talking about that as, we call it a behavior, but really it's communication, right? So I try not to take it personally. Okay, something about this meal is not sitting right with Cecil. That's what I'm going to hear, rather than Cecil's being angry, he's being aggressive, right? So what we know is that hearing is not impaired. We don't need to yell louder, right? And now they might be hearing impaired because dementia and aging are highly correlated, right? And hearing loss and aging is highly correlated. but it's not a function of dementia. So I don't need to yell at Cecil, they're green beans, Cecil. Right? I don't need to yell. I might need to be more clear in the way I'm speaking. They're green beans, right? Instead of, so Cecil, here are your green beans. I know you really like them, right? Whoa, I'm talking fast. I'm talking really fast, and I'm giving him way too much information. So green beans, Cecil. Yeah, right. Keep it. Well, okay, see, he says he loves them, but I don't know. Okay. So the other thing to be aware is that automatic social response. Remember when I said, how you doing, and you said fine? Right? Some of you in this room are not fine, but you all said you were fine, right? And so I might get that automatic social response. So I want to be aware that when I say, Hope, would you like some green beans for dinner tonight? Yes. Or I might get an automatic no if I'm asking a yes or no question, right? So being careful that I'm not asking a question I don't want to actually hear the answer to. So I might be getting an automatic response, and it might be that she doesn't actually understand the question. And I say, well, here's your green beans. Well, I don't want those. But you told me earlier you wanted those. You said yes when I asked if that. She might not have understood my question. And then we talked about this decreased ability to process formal language. So keeping our cues really short rather than long explanations, and pairing a verbal cue with a visual cue. So what I mean by that is, Cecil, it's time to eat, right? Or, Cecil, you want something to drink? Right? Even better, I get the drink. Cecil, have a drink, right? So I'm giving him the visual of what I want him to do, or what I'm asking of him, as well as with the verbal, so that we get multiple cues going there. And then decreased ability to process and produce, really, nouns. So that'll be the first thing that you'll notice that will go, you know, I want the one, you know, the one with the stuff on. That's the one I want. Were you gonna make it for me?
It's right here.
That's not what I'm looking for. So this escalated quite quickly, right? Because I'm using a lot of words that are very generic, because I can't come up with the one with the stuff on top, right? Well, that could be a million things when we're talking about food, right? So as a care partner, I might say, tell me more about it. What does it taste like? What does it look like? Well, you know, it's kind of white and the red with the little circles on it, you know, and you
Yeah.
You know?
Pizza, right?
Oh yeah. That's what. See. So I was able to describe a lot of things about the pizza, and Steve and I didn't plan this either, so that was pretty good. I'm going to put Steve down as my caregiver when I get older. Right? So Steve was able to take the cues that I was giving and figure out, just by asking, tell me more about it, or show me what it looks like. Right? So trying to help people come up with the word they're looking for. All right. So sensory and motor changes in dementia. So we're seeing the same piece of toast coming up out of our brain, except for this time we're looking at the very top. Our sensory and motor strips are right next to each other, right here on the top of our brain. And this is what helps us with sensation, bringing things in. We're going to talk about sensation here in a minute, but also with motor function. So the changes that we might see are fine motor control in your hands and your feet, but we don't use our feet a lot for eating, so I'm going to kind of skip that. So let's talk about our hands for a minute. Has everybody got a pen or something that looks like a pen-ish? Okay. So pick up your pen as if it is your spoon. All right, pretend you got your spoon. Pick it up, okay? All right, I want everybody to do a little bit of eating. Nice. Good. Doesn't taste very good, does it? Yeah. All right, now I want you to look, now pause and look at your fingers. Which fingers are you primarily using right now to hold this spoon and move this spoon? The thumb and the first finger and the middle finger. Yeah. So those three fingers are what we call our skill fingers, right? They're innervated by the same nerve, right? And then our last two fingers over here are innervated by their own nerve, right? So there would help us to hold on to things with more of what we call a gross grasp. If you've got your hammer and you're ready, you're opening the peanut butter jar, I'm really using those last two fingers. But when I do what we call fine motor skills, which is writing, buttons, zip your zippers, using that spoon to really make sure we get exactly the right amount of soup on our spoon, we're using these first three fingers. And what we know about people living with dementia is that those skills can often be affected when these motor skills are starting to change, usually around the middle of the disease, depends on what disease you're looking at, right? So eventually the person will also have gross motor changes, and what we mean by gross motor is this action, right? Moving the entire arm, that's more of a gross motor action. When we think about gross motor, we think about big movements, right? Kicking a soccer ball, that's a gross motor action. Right? Whereas fine motor is that smaller stuff that we're doing, right? So you might notice people are having trouble with that fine motor skill, and they might hold their, oh my God, I'm gonna move my slides. They might hold their spoon with more of a gross grasp, right? You notice that kids often do this when they're first starting to learn, because kids start off with a gross grasp, and then they develop the fine grasp. And so when people are living with dementia, it kind of goes in reverse, the way that we're losing these skills. Now, analogies about children are really dangerous in dementia care, so I want to be very mindful of that, because people at the end of their life, when they're living with dementia, are not children, right? And so this is the problem. If we make that a one-to-one correlation, then we start treating people with dementia like children. That does not go well for anyone, and it's not a way of being person-centered, as we learned from Sonia. So we want to make sure that we are aware of that the way we treat people is not like children. But when we think about some of these developmental skills, it very much can happen that way. So sometimes you might have somebody who is using their silverware more with a gross grasp, right? Which is great. If it's working for them, awesome. We'll keep doing it, right? As long as it's working. Now, eventually that will change, and we'll think about some strategies for that. Also, things like balance and strength. So actually just maintaining the strength to move your arm, maintaining your core strength to sit upright. That can change both with dementia and with aging. So when we think about these motor skills, fine motor changes, what do we want to do to support somebody who's having these fine motor changes? So there's quite a few things we can think about. So one would be adapted silverware. So if they're having trouble, I really actually like these pens because they're nice and thick, right? So it can be really hard when fine motor skills are changing to hold things that are really, really thin. So like usually a spoon or a fork, the end that you hold is really small, right? And so that can be really hard. So you might find, and you can just look it up on Amazon, where I buy everything in my life. They also don't pay me. But you can just do foam built-up handles, and you can get them with different size holes too, or you can stick different items in there, one being silverware, in order to kind of build up that handle so that person might be able to use the fine motor grasp, or they might just have an easier time with a gross motor grasp if that's what they're using now. You can also do things like a plate guard. There's a picture of a plate guard. So it's just a thing that sticks to the end of the plate and helps people when they're having trouble collecting the food on their silverware. And then this is just a built-up handle, but it's permanent, right? It's not the foam that you take on and off. So a lot of times the Good Grips brand has this kind of built-up handles on it. And then also I had put on there silverware technology. So if you go, there's a group called Liftware, which I might have put that on your handout, which is in your folder. It's called Liftware, and they have one that's called a Liftware Level, and it's really cool because it's technology that notices where the end of the spoon or the fork is in space, And so if you take your fork or your spoon and you hold it up this way, the spoon will actually remain level, so you physically cannot dump the contents of your spoon. It's really neat. If we have extra time, we can show you a video. Otherwise, you can see a video on our website. But it's really neat. It's made a lot of times for people with spinal cord injuries who are having trouble controlling their supination. Remember that word we learned earlier, right? And so they're having trouble with that scooping, but that can also happen with people living with dementia. And so it's an interesting tool. It could be problematic for somebody with dementia because it's really weird to watch a spoon move. So you might want to try it out before you buy it, depending on whether it will work for the person you're caring for. Another thing we can think about is just offering finger foods, right? So instead of having soup and making someone use a spoon, if that skill is difficult for them, just change the food that we're giving them to make it something that they can eat on their own without having assistance. Also, aprons to contain spills. So making sure, again, that we are having a forgiving environment. It's okay that we spill, right? Making sure that that's okay. We can use an apron if we want to try to be a little bit more clean. Gross motor changes. So when we start to have trouble even holding our spoon like this and moving it to our mouth, that's when we want to help people using a technique my friend Teepa and her colleague Melanie Bunn developed called hand under hand. And maybe my friend Cecil, will you come help me, please? Cecil looks like he's not so sure. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you eat anything. We'll just stand here. Come stand right here. There you go. Thank you. All right. So I got my spoon. I got my friend Cecil. Let's say my friend Cecil is living with dementia and he's having trouble moving his hand to his mouth. So he's just staring at his food. He's not doing anything. Even though it's finger food, he's not using it. He's not using his tools. He's not using his hands. He's just not eating it. But I think that Cecil might be hungry, so I'm going to try to help him. Now, one way I can help him is by taking my spoon and just jabbing the food in his mouth. That's going to go well for Cecil. He's going to like that a lot. So it might surprise him, right? If his visual field, if he has those binoculars on and I start shoving food in, what's going to happen? Cecil, right? He might get scared. He might take that sharp intake of breath. Then what's going to happen to the food I just put in his mouth? My friend Cecil is going to either spit it out, or he's going to aspirate it, or he's going to choke, and none of those things are good, right? So if I'm going to use what Teepa and Melanie call hand under hand, is I'm going to shake Cecil's hand. There we go. And then I'm going to shift into kind of an arm wrestle position, right? But because I'm a good care partner, I'm going to let Cecil win the arm wrestle, right? So now his hand is on top, and my hand is under his hand, which is why we call it hand under hand. Now you see that I have my 3 skill fingers right here available to me. That's excellent. So I get my spoon. I put my spoon here. I might support Cecil under this arm like this. And then I get my food, and I'm going to help Cecil move his hand in a normal pattern that his brain has been used to for the past many decades. So I got my food here. There we go. See? All right. Thank you, Cecil. I appreciate you. Yeah, so you can see videos of this. Teepa has quite a few videos. If you just Google Teepa Snow hand under hand, you'll probably find some of those on the internet. But it's a good technique for helping people to eat rather than feeding people, right? We want to assist people. We don't want to force feed people. The other nice thing is that if Cecil is done with whatever I am trying to help him eat, he can push back on my hand, and that's a signal to me that he either doesn't want any more food, or he needs a break, or he wants something else from his plate. So he can communicate with me non-verbally by pushing away on my hand, and that gives me a message. All right. And then if you see strength changes, so we could support people with supportive seating to help them sit more upright. We can use pillows for positioning. supporting under the elbow. So sometimes people will have trouble because you both have to use a shoulder motion and an elbow motion in order to get food, right, from the plate. I'm using both my shoulder and my elbow, so sometimes I can put a pillow or something on under my elbow, and then all I have to do is this motion, and I'm not requiring anything of my shoulder. So that can help people sometimes as well. And then again, forgiving silverware, plates, and cups, right? So if I am having weakness, then I might drop things. And so is it forgiving? Is it okay if I drop this? Or if I drop it, is my silverware going to help me out, right, by being plastic instead of metal? Is my cup not going to spill because I have a lid on it? Things like that. And then chewing and swallowing problems. I'm not a speech therapist, but there are speech therapists in the world, and they're wonderful. So you can talk to them about, ask your physician for a speech therapy consult, either outpatient or home health. And speech therapy can come out and help you with those chewing and swallowing issues that you might see. Taste and smell changes. So when we think about what the research is telling us about taste and smell change, in normal aging, we will have a decline in odor identification. So this is normal. It accelerates after people pass 70 years old. The deficits you notice are greater in mild cognitive impairment, and then they get even greater with Alzheimer's disease in the one study that I found that was talking about this. So identifying odors can become a challenge. You'll see with dementia a deficit in odor sensitivity, which means the minimum amount of that odor that you need for someone to reliably be able to detect the odor, to tell that there is an odor in the room. So when you are presenting food, you want to make sure you're using more flavoring than you normally would, right? So this is why people with dementia will add like 10 sugars to their coffee, right? Because they're not always tasting that sugar, they're not always tasting that spice, they're not always and so they might add quite a bit. So if you're cooking, you might want to add more spices that are a less bad effect on our bodies than sugar. So maybe trying some things that are maybe a little more spicy than the person used to like, you know, adding a little more curry powder to that dish than you normally would, adding a little more chili powder to that chili that you are serving, because it might take more of that spice for the person to pick up on that.
But not too much salt.
But not too much salt. If we've got blood pressure, heart failure issues, be careful with our salt. Yep. She lived in town where I was a teenager at that time, and my mom was her primary caregiver and decision maker for her, and she had full-time caregivers in the home. They were very lucky that they could stay and afford to have that. And my mom knew that my grandmother really liked Kit Kat bars. So my mom would get these Kit Kat bars when she would do the weekly shopping trip for my grandma, take the Kit Kat bars over. She went to visit the next day after a shopping run, and she couldn't find the Kit Kat bars. And she goes up to the caregiver and she says, "Where are the Kit Kat bars? I just bought like 6 packs of Kit Kat bars yesterday." And the caregiver said, "Well, Helen was eating all of them, and she just kept eating them, and she just kept eating them, so I hid them." Now, who's right or wrong in this situation? So for my mom, who very much recognized that my grandmother was pretty close to the end of her life, within a year or two, my mom said, "Well, you know, Helen doesn't have diabetes, and I'm not really concerned about her weight gain," which she was gaining a lot of weight, but I'm not concerned about it, and she's getting a lot of pleasure and joy out of these Kit Kat bars. So I would like for you to not hide the Kit Kat bars anymore. And that's the choice that my mom made for my grandmother, and it was the right one for her. For another family, that might not be the right answer, and it might be that we do try to limit sugar intake. If someone is at a different place in their disease, if someone has other health conditions going on where sugar could lead them to be in the hospital, this might not be the choice that they make. So I don't really give a direct recommendation on this one, because this is really a personal choice, and it's one where you think about risk reduction versus quality of life. What are you going to do? So it's a very personal choice, but just know that you might see that the person with dementia will gravitate towards sugar. If you put that dessert on the table, Greg's going to eat it first, right? He's going to eat that, And Steve might steal Greg's apple pie because that's what Steve likes, right? So we want to think about what the person is going to be really wanting, and a lot of times they'll want that sugar. And for all people, smell and taste goes directly to the limbic system. And so the limbic system is right there by our amygdala and right there by where we create long-term memories. And so you don't have to think about what you are smelling in order to have an emotional response to it. So does anybody have smells like that, where you smell it and immediately you're taken somewhere else? Yeah. So for me, it's my grandmother's perfume, right, which I haven't smelled in years, but if I smell it today, immediately, before I even know what that smell is, I will have an emotional response because of my relationship with my grandmother, right? And so we want to think about how can we use taste and smell to bring more memories of things like that first picture I showed of me with my chocolate, right? How can we use that in order to create positive memories for people living with dementia? So evoking those fond memories. So in our last few minutes, turn to the person next to you, and I want you to tell them, did you pick up anything from our time together today? What will you try? What will you try differently for somebody that you're caring for or somebody that you know? So talk to your neighbor for a second.
Well, I think all these suggestions are good for people. Like, the interesting thing is that both of all the speakers, the things and the suggestions are great for grandkids. They're great, like the way that you communicate with your spouse.
Yeah, I appreciate
but
enabling.
it just makes me appreciate all the mundane things that we do. Like when we did it's like just makes me feel like, wow, number one, I have full range of vision, but just the people that we're caring for, that their behavior is not that unusual.
Well, we had one in the elderly.
All right.
I got too much on my plate.
Yeah.
And I said, well, just eat what you can.
All right, I heard talking in the room, which means that people must have gotten something that they're taking away, which I'm really glad for. Here's a zillion references if you would like to look up all the things. And then I want to say thank you, and I heard a question over here, so go for it in our last 1 minute. Oh, okay.
I just wanted to ask about the process of voluntarily stopping and eating and drinking. If you see that, is that something that is typically seen in the dementia and the Alzheimer process, number one? Number two, is there
Could you speak louder, please?
Oh, I can already have it, yeah.
Number two, is there typically a moment in time where you know that process has begun? And number three, what is the conversation around that when that starts to happen?
Oh yeah. So I'll be here for another hour talking about her question. So her question was voluntarily stopping eating and drinking with people living with dementia. How do you know that that's what they're doing, is not wanting to eat and drink? How does that happen? And then how do you have that conversation? So the 30-second answer to that question is yes. When people are really at the very end of this disease, their bodies will no longer want to take in food because they're not getting anything nutritious out of that food. It's why feeding tubes don't really work for people at the end of dementia, because their body is not able to process. The body's in the process of shutting down. And so our bodies are made to die. People's bodies know how to die. And so the body will stop eating. What we want to do is make sure we don't mistake that moment, which is why I really like hand under hand. Because if I'm helping Cecil to eat, and he's opening his mouth and he's going for it, and then I know that Cecil wants to eat, right? Whereas if Cecil's mouth is closed, his eyes are closed, he's pushing me away, I can tell that Cecil doesn't want to eat. So we can have that communication without talking about it, because at that point Cecil's language skills are probably not very strong if they're with us at all. And so I can kind of communicate without words with somebody with dementia if I'm using hand under hand, because I can tell whether they're going to want to eat that. I'm also probably giving them food for pleasure rather than nutrition at that point. So all the chocolate syrup for me when I get to that point. But when you ask about conversations, that's a conversation to have either today or like years ago for some people, right? We want to have those conversations before people have dementia, which is what do you want? And that's a whole nother program that we could put on another conference, which is advanced care
I
planning.
think more what I meant is that really sort of the moment you recognize, like you take some of the ambiguity out of whether they really are starting that process or if it's just their
Do you recognize that? Yeah. And so I would bring in a speech therapist to that moment just to make sure I'm not missing something. Am I not missing something that's happening that I don't know about eating and drinking? Because there's a lot of things speech therapists know that I don't know. I would bring in a dementia care consultant to help you figure out whether they're actually refusing to eat and that's not what they want, or they can't figure out how to eat, things like that. I would talk to your physician. I'd bring in a lot of people to that conversation. But I would also just keep offering the food, and they can take it or not take it. But I wouldn't try to force the food because it's not going to help if you're truly at the end. Yeah. But those are good conversations to have a long time before you get to that point. Yeah. Oh, we've got a question. Yeah.
Question and observation. What you're saying about the evocative senses of smell. When I was in the 8th grade, my face was smashed, I broke my nose, I lost my sense of smell. I had zero smell for almost 3 years. My brother gave me Estee Lauder Youth Dew, which I wear to this day, and it was the first thing I could smell. I went crazy. I sprayed it all over my, I'm going like this, and I walk out, I'm one of 17 children, we're at supper, and everybody goes, oh my God! You know, what are you doing? Yeah. What is that? Yeah. And it was that. But to this day, like my husband gives it to me now, and I'm off it during the summer because it's strong, but I get back onto it when it gets cold out. Once I smell that, I am back in that big mansion house. I am back with my brothers and sisters. I can see meals. It's unbelievable. I don't get this from anything else, but I can't explain to you how exactly explicit and strong. I see all their faces. I see the supper table.
Smell just bypasses that front part of our brain and just goes right to the emotion. And so we don't really have to process it. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Music will bring those memories
and
too.
music.
Because it's all over your brain. It's in your temporal lobe.
Yeah.
And it's not just the sound of the music, it's the rhythm, and it's the words.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people talk about memories coming back.
Memories and music, absolutely. Yeah.
Mentioned there have been a lot of studies regarding people that are choking when they're eating.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important that they don't have to focus on anything else except eating so they can swallow. When you have conversations or getting their mind going on something else, they forget how to swallow. So that's really, really important for people.
Yeah, not distracting people while they're eating, kind of keeping conversations to a minimum. And if you notice they're starting to choke or cough a lot, you definitely want to get speech therapy involved so they can help you figure out what's going on in that situation. Definitely. All right. Thank you all. Thank you to all my people that I messed with up here.